In this video, I want to discuss the bones that make up the human skull. The human skeleton can be divided into two broad categories. We have the axial skeleton, which is comprised of the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column, and then the appendicular skeleton, which covers your limbs, upper and lower limbs, and the bones that allow those limbs to move around, the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle. The human skull is made up of 22 bones. And if you think about the skull, just think about how complex a structure it is. There are sections that are rounded. There are sections that are flat. There are sections that go in. There are sections that come out. It has to hold and protect your special sensory organs such as your eyes or your ears or your nose. And so all of this complexity demands many, many bones that each can do a little piece of that. The skull is also fairly symmetrical, so in many cases there's one bone on the right and on the left. Out of all of those bones, every place two bones connect is a joint, but out of all of those bones and all of those joints, there's only one joint that actually moves, and that is the joint for your lower jaw. So these 22 bones all together form the sections on the skull that we call the cranium or the brain box, the face, and then the jaw. And we also tend to include those three pairs of inner ear bones, 3 bones on the right, 3 bones on the left, that are actually positioned inside the skull itself. The shapes, because it is such a complex and unusual structure, the shapes of the bones are predominantly flat ones and ones that are just don't fit anywhere else, and we call those irregular shapes. The bones of the skull are held together by fibrous joints that are made up of dense connective tissue, and the place where they connect are known as sutures. These joints are essentially immovable. They can flex a little bit, but they certainly are not freely movable like your shoulder or even your elbow or knee. These suture edges might be fairly smooth, like the ones that join some of the facial bones, or they can be very serrated, very zigzaggy, as you see on this illustration of the sutures on the top of the head. Because there are so many bones in the skull, there are many, many sutures, and I just want to point out a couple of the big ones that you can see on the top of the skull. This one that divides sort of the front and the back is the coronal suture. There's also one that runs right along the top. You can see it over here, which is the sagittal suture. Then the lambdoidal suture is here in the back, and we have the squamous suture here on the side. So those are the couple of the most important large sutures on the skull. So let's go over the bones of the cranium, basically the brain box. So this would end at about this point. It is the brain sits in a box. There is a floor to the skull, even though you don't usually think about it when you look at a skull. The very back of the skull, this purple one here, is your occipital bone. And you'll find when we get to the nervous system that the lobes of the brain that sit under these major bones also have that same name. So you have an occipital lobe in your brain that is underneath the occipital bone. Parietal means side, so you have 2 parietal bones, right and left. So that is the blue ones that we see here. Frontal bone is going to make up your forehead, so that one's easy to remember. The temporal bones are around your temples, or sort of here's the ear would be right here, because here's the opening to the inner ear canal. So the temporal bone is this red one. And then there are 2 very small, or not very small, but 2 very hidden bones when you're looking at the skull in this point. You're going to see them more on the next picture, and that's the ethmoid and the sphenoid bone. You can just see a corner of the sphenoid bone here, this purple one, and the ethmoid bone is down, this little blue that we get a tiny peek at, but it's actually a much larger bone. So if we slice the skull in half, going like above the top of the ears, and then we're looking down into the brain case. So this is the floor of the brain we are looking at. This green butterfly-shaped bone is the sphenoid bone, and then it kind of curls up along the side. You don't really get a sense of it from this perspective that it actually goes up the side, but it does. And then this red bone that we see just a part of here, but it actually is kind of large and more irregular than we get a sense of in this illustration, is your ethmoid bone. So those two bones make up the base of the skull. We're looking like we've sliced off the top of the head. We're looking down into the head at this point, looking at kind of a bowl-shaped structure. I just want to point out while I'm here that there are numerous holes in your skull because you have your brain inside, but the nerves that are going to take the information to the rest of the body have to get out, and so they have to get out through the bones. So you're going to have various spaces, empty spaces, that those nerves can flow through. This biggest one is where your spinal cord will go out, but then these many small ones will take care of many of the cranial nerves. And along with the nerves going out of the brain, you have to have blood vessels coming into the brain, bringing you oxygenated blood, and then veins going out, taking that blood back to be reoxygenated. So your bones, all your bones, not just your skull, but your bones all over your body do have holes in them as places for blood vessels to go in or nerves to go in, so that the bone, living bone tissue can be nourished, and whatever structures are being surrounded by that bone can receive the nutrients and the nerve signals that they need. Now let's move on to the bones of the face. So we've got the frontal bone here. So we're talking about kind of everything below this point. There are 14 bones that make up the face in various shapes and sizes, and they all sort of fit together like a puzzle to create that very complex structure that is our face. So starting kind of at the top of your nose, you have your nasal bone here. So this is the bridge of the nose. The rest of your nose, remember, is cartilage. And then providing structure to the bottom of your nose, you have a very small bone, the volar bone, which we see here. And then inside the nasal cavity itself, sort of sticking out from the side, you have a series of shelves. There's actually 6 of them that are known as nasal conchae. And so they're the ones you see curling here, and these help slow down the airflow and help give the time for that air to be well moisturized and humidified so that it's at the right temperature and humidity to go into your lungs. Then moving out from the nasal passage, we have the zygomatic bones, and those are the ones that form the outside of your eye socket and sort of your cheekbones. And with many of these bones on the face, there is a right and a left version, and of course, all of these places where they are connecting, those would be the various sutures. On many of the facial bones, the sutures are very smooth. You can see this very smooth suture that runs between the two sections of the nasal bone, the right and left sides, unlike the bones of the skull where you have those very zigzaggy, serrated kind of sutures. Tiny bones that support your tear ducts, the lacrimal bones, can be seen right here. And then the top of your jaw, that does not move, but the part underneath your nose, it's holding your upper teeth, is the maxilla. So this section in yellow is the maxilla. It's a very large bone. Again, it comes in 2 parts, so it does fuse together down the middle. The mandible, we already talked about when we were identifying the skeleton, is that lower jaw, and it's the only bone that's going to be freely movable on the skull. And then inside the mouth, we have the palatine bone, which we're going to see on the next slide. So now again, we're looking at a different perspective on the skull. In this case, we've taken the whole skull, taken off that lower jaw and turned it upside down. So we're looking at the bottom of the brain case here. But if you look at the upper jaw, here are our teeth, and the palatine bone is this very, very back section of the roof of the mouth. The main section of the roof of the mouth is actually coming from the maxilla, the part that, is holding these teeth and going up to the bottom of your nose. So the front part of your mouth is all part of that bone, and then in the very back we have the palatine bone. And again, here's your sphenoid bone, that butterfly-shaped bone that's part of the base of the cranial case. An interesting fact is that sometimes you have extra bones in the skull that form along the suture lines. We're not quite sure why this happens. It may be there's a genetic predisposition, because it certainly is involved as a marker in some genetic diseases, and it does differ from one ethnic group to the other. It's more common among Chinese skulls, especially if they are male. But these small bones have their own name. They're called Vermean bones, named after the scientist who discovered them. So you can see we've got a small bone here and another one here. So instead of a nice sagittal suture that goes straight down, separating the two parietal bones of the skull, you have these small bones that are mixed in with it. And so this is something that not everybody has, and it's not anything that is a problem, but it's just sort of an interesting fact that you sometimes will see extra bones in the skull. I wanted to end by saying something about the skull of infants, or the neonatal skull. Babies, you may already know, are born with soft spots in their skull, and these soft spots have the scientific name of fontanelles. There are actually two of them. The one in the front is much larger and more obvious. Most people know about that, but there also is a small one in the back. And these soft spots are there so that the skull itself can change shape if it has to pass through a narrow birth canal. So some babies come out with more of a elongated head instead of a round head, just because of the amount of pressure that was put on the skull sliding out during the birthing process. These soft spots, as long as they're not punctured with any kind of sharp object, will not be a problem, and they will close. The smaller one in the back closes at about 2 or 3 months of age, and this one larger one in the front is usually closed by 18 months. In fact, all of the bones of the skull of an infant do remain slightly separated for the first year to year and a half, so that that rapid brain growth can occur without pressure being put on the newly developing brain by that hard bone case. And so babies' heads are just a little more tender, you have to be a little more careful about them, but most people that are handling babies are concerned and take, precautions not to do anything that might damage the baby's head. So to check for understanding, can you explain why the skull has to be made of so many bones? Why do you need 22 bones to create that shape? Can you talk about the type of joint that connects the various bones of the skull? Can you define a fontanelle and explain why they are found on infants' head? And can you label the bones of the cranium and the face that have been discussed in this video? I did give you some pictures on your notes so that you can add labels on that, and we will have some time to practice in class. If you're unsure about any of these things, go back and review so you'll be ready for the quiz.